Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For this episode, I was joined by Scott Spillias, who is a research scientist at CSIRO and affiliated with the Center for Marine Socioecology at the University of Tasmania. And I was also joined by Beth Fulton, who is Chief Research Scientist with CSIRO and the Deputy Director of the Center for Marine Socioecology. They were both here to talk to me today about the rapidly developing use of AI in ecosystem modeling. It was a great discussion, and I learned quite a lot. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you both. So just to get started, I thought I would ask a question that's incredibly basic and also incredibly unfair, and I ask it of nearly everybody, which is to summarize, the broad swath of your work that you've been engaged in for your entire career, with a very simple question. What is ecosystem modeling, and sort of how is it used? I think we're just looking for a very basic introduction.
So if you could imagine a version of the world inside your computer with all of the ocean currents and all the different animals and the way people use them and interact with them, that's essentially what ecosystem modelling is. It can be done in a lot of detail, or it can be done almost like a cartoon, but it's a way of helping explore the world. So effectively a flight simulator for scientists and managers to understand how the world works, and if you do something, is it going to have a benefit, or is it actually going to have some unintended consequences that are going to trip everything up?
Okay, great. So that makes quite a bit of sense. I'm imagining, though, that a model that encompasses so many different elements would be incredibly complex and hard to administer. Doing this, at least up until the last few years, was something that I would imagine took a lot of work. What goes into that process?
So from my perspective, when I started, we had to do it literally all by hand. There wasn't even things like GIS. So that slowly evolved through time, but it's still a months to years long process of collating data, getting it to effectively work with each other, not to have a species suddenly go extinct in the model that aren't going extinct in reality. And that's quite apart from the time it takes to develop and maintain the code, and what are the equations? How do you represent a fish? How do you represent human decision making? So that's a big and complicated set of processes.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly tricky. And now I'm wondering, how does AI begin to come onto the scene? When did people start thinking about this as a possibility for, making new models or adjusting current models, that sort of thing?
Well, I'll jump in. I think we could probably say that Beth realized that this would be an opportunity a few years ago because she hired me to basically work on this. And it was actually really good timing because I started this project about 3 years ago as a postdoctoral fellowship. And just a few months before I started, ChatGPT kind of burst onto the scene. I guess it was late 2021 or something, 2022. People started using it, and people started realizing that it was actually really good at coding. And so, a lot of ecosystem modeling, as Beth said, a lot of it's happening inside of a computer. There's obviously a lot that happens outside of a computer, but just in terms of low-hanging fruit, realizing that AI is good for navigating these digital spaces, then you realize that you can start to use it for a lot of simple things. So, a lot of people like me in this ecosystem modeling space start off as ecologists. Maybe they do field work, and then they slowly make their way into the office where they realize that you can have big impact by working on these virtual simulations, but maybe don't have the technical coding software skills. And so having something like, ChatGPT and other large language models to augment their ability to represent the ecology and what they see in the real world in these computer worlds is, a huge advantage.
And I'm wondering if I can ask you to sort of bridge the gap just a little bit. And I know that we can't get into too much specificity because you'll completely lose me. But I'm wondering about bridging the gap between, the average layperson's experience using something like ChatGPT or Claude, and, how this type of task would be undertaken. How does one interact with, a chatbot or a large language model when embarking on, something like ecosystem modeling?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's in a lot of different ways. I guess one thing we try to make clear in the paper is that there are ecosystem modeling is not just one thing. There's lots of different components that go into it, from interacting with stakeholders to collating data from different parameter values from maybe different species of marine organisms, running it, writing the code, etc. So there's lots of different ways, and so each one of those little components you might interact with a chatbot like ChatGPT in a different way, asking it for a different thing. So one way you might prompt it to write code for you, saying it to write a bunch of equations, mathematical equations, and you might need to have a really involved prompt, really lots of detail about the system that you're working with, the organisms you're working with. And other times it could be really simple things like I'm trying to find the reproduction rate of a particular fish that lives in this place. And the data is out there, but you can Google search it and you can look through the literature to find it. Or these days the things like GPT-5 and other LLMs can actually search the web for you. So you can just ask them really simply, what is the growth rate or what is the reproduction rate of this fish? It'll go off, search the literature, tell you what it is, and it'll give you a citation as well. So depending on what task you're asking it to do, you might prompt it in different ways. And some of the stuff we're working on as well is starting to mosaic all those different things together. So you have a pipeline to try to attack all of these things at once.
Perhaps the biggest difference potentially to at least some of the people who use ChatGPT for, say, less scientific questions is at least in the prompts that I've been using, I ask it for its chain of logic. How did you get to that conclusion? Where's the evidence coming from, so that you can more easily go back and verify it yourself, so that you're effectively working collaboratively with the AI as if it was an enthusiastic young researcher, but that you still have to validate and check its steps to make sure that it isn't inventing something, or you need to be auditable in that sense, particularly if it's going to feed into decision making.
Yeah, and I'll actually pit them against each other. So I'll have one, produce something for me, whether it be code or whatever, and then I'll take that and I'll start a new chat with another one and give it to it and ask it to explain it to me, or to verify that it does the thing that the other one told me it did, so that you kind of avoid that sort of where you try to get around that sycophantic behavior where you're asking one for one thing and it gives it to you and it wants to please you, but maybe it's kind of ignoring some obvious things. And so then we can give it to another one and say, be really critical of this thing that I have here. And then that one wants to please you, so it's going to try its best to be critical. And you can kind of then evaluate what each one says, and you kind of get that maybe more diverse opinion.
So what it sounds like you're speaking to is, a replication or repeat of, the phenomena that a lot of people deal with when they deal with, any large language model, generative AI, platform, which is that it, has a tendency to, of course, adopt that sycophantic tone and, perhaps hallucinate and, do those sorts of things. So, the challenges that one encounters when, writing a marketing email might be in some senses similar to the challenges that you would encounter if you were doing ecosystem modeling.
Having never written a marketing that kind of survey, I don't exactly know what they're looking at. But yeah, that requirement for it to be not blowing smoke up your ass is the term that we'd probably use in Australia. To actually get to the crux of the matter in a reliable way and effectively a way that's got a degree of honesty to it. That's easier where you've got expert knowledge of the system and you're using it just to speed up the creation of a piece of code that you can then quickly run your eyes across. It gets more challenging as you get to try to synthesize information over a broader set of disciplines. So when you're creating an ecosystem model, you've got to be on top of oceanography and ecology and economics and psychology and a whole bunch of fields that you're probably not specifically trained in initially. So having ways to synthesize the information in a way that you can cross-check with experts or to cross-check across different platforms is one of the most necessary parts in trusting the use of AI and building these kind of large system models.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I found it super helpful it's hard to be across all of those different things, to be an expert in all of those. And so, but you can, so what I'll do is if I'm kind of lacking in one space, you can actually talk to these chatbots and you can say, I'm trying to do this kind of thing and kind of describe it in vague terms because maybe I don't have the right words, I don't have the language or the expertise. But they can oftentimes be like, oh, well, you're talking about this, and just give me the right terminology. So then I can go and research those kind of ideas myself, and I can kind of just jump straight to just it can give me the signpost to lead the way to the kind of knowledge that I need, the expertise that I need, and that might be in the form of collaborating with another expert in that field or papers that I can then read myself.
Right. So it sounds like there's, a massive, ability that you're granted when you're using these types of tools to, have that ready-made research assistant who's able to do many things that, a human being wouldn't be able to do at a speed and pace and scale that, aren't available to all. And you might not necessarily need to have the coding prowess that would traditionally be required for these tasks. So it seems like that there are massive advantages and a subsequent sort of inevitability in some sense that this is going to be used as a tool. But you also, of course, in the article, point out some of the potential challenges and pitfalls of, widespread adoption in particular. So I was hoping you could kind of characterize those for us a little bit and give us a sense of, what are some of the things, and we can start with, one or two and talk through them and then jump to more. But what are some of the types of things that are of concern when we think about the widespread adoption of a technology like this to be implemented in an overall field like ecosystem modeling?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked through quite a few of them. Some to come to mind right now, things like the over reliance on tools like these. I think that's something where it's kind of hard to tell what the outcome of that kind of thing is. Will it become the case that our ability to do the kind of ecosystem modeling that we have done, will that atrophy in a way? So then we won't be able to have proper oversight. We talk a lot about how human oversight is really important for these kind of things. But if we are bringing up young people to work in this space and they're learning to use these tools and they never learned to do it, quote unquote, by hand, will that be an issue? Maybe it will and maybe it won't. It's hard to tell. How many of us do long division by hand anymore? And that doesn't seem to slow us down. Another thing, things like the homogenization of ideas. These chatbots, they're all trained on a really diverse range of sources, but you can kind of see, and anybody who works with these and people are becoming more and more experienced just reading text from chatbots, and you can sort of see they have a way about them that's kind of easy to see. And if we start building, especially ecosystem models with these kind of tools, in a way that might give us a sort of consistency that we've lacked in the past. But then it might also be that they all just become kind of the same, and we lose some of the benefits of having diverse perspectives on these kind of things. In the field of ecosystem modeling, there's many different ways of modeling ecosystems. Beth has spearheaded the Atlantis model, which is a really impressive piece of technology, but there are other ways of doing that. And we know that having a diversity of those approaches for even the same place is advantageous because they give you slightly different insights to what's happening in the system. There's a certain structural uncertainty that having those different representations can help you understand. And so if we just have AIs making ecosystem models, do they then all look the same and we don't benefit from having that diversity of opinion or diversity of perspective? So a kind of a couple red flags. I don't know if Beth has any others.
There is another one that I'd like to flag, and that's the different knowledge type. So the large language models have obviously been trained on effectively written literature, accessible literature, which is not across all cultures. So, for instance, in Australia and across the Pacific, we do a lot of modelling in collaboration with First Nations groups. Now, their knowledge is not a part of those large language models, so without direct consultation of them, you wouldn't be able to bring in those other knowledge types. It's not a part of the AI, but equally they couldn't really easily include it because then they would lose sovereignty over that knowledge. So there is a tension there. Another one is that I'm all for the democratization of knowledge and the access to knowledge and helping decision making, but it's also my experience that you have to understand the limitations of the models. They can look like they're working fine, and actually they've got, they only work for certain circumstances, or you have to look out for the warning signs in the signals you're getting out of the model, and that can take some long, hard-won experience. So for people to have the capacity to easily access that information, we kind of need a capacity uplift in the user end. Now, that's probably true of AI in general, but particularly when it's married to a method like ecosystem modeling, where you could, with all of the best of intentions, still end up misinterpreting or getting misinformation out of a less informed interaction with a large language model helping you do something. So it's the potential for accidental misuse, let alone malicious misuse, that is a concern around the use of these, marrying the two tools together.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk more about the potential for misuse in a moment, but I wanted to touch a little bit more on the role of traditional ecological knowledge and what does not typically wind up within a large language model system. I always worry about a somewhat related problem of equity in large language models in my, sort of publishing world, because a lot of times, the AI models are simply not trained on data that's behind a paywall. And, typically one pays an enormous publication fee to a journal or other publishing outlet in order to publish open access. So, we have this sense in which the most privileged are receiving the most privileged treatment of their data and publications. And it seems as though the traditional ecological knowledge point is even more sticky, because even if there is simply no way to train that into the system, so there is no way to incorporate it. Has there been any attempt to address that, or any thoughts about addressing that, or is it a matter of making the model and then adjusting it afterward to try to incorporate what's been learned through fair and equitable research, or how do you deal with that?
Well, yeah, I would say I would maybe push back a bit against your one point that it's not possible, because it is, but I think we aren't there yet. And so what I mean is that tools like these LLMs that we're using today, the frontier ones, GPT-5, Claude 4, whatever, wherever we're at, they're the ones that are really impressive, and they've been trained on data that we just don't understand. But there is a really growing, really capable open source library of these large language models. A lot of them are coming out of China, but there's some coming from other places. You can download these models and you can train them yourselves. And so my perspective is that probably there's a solution in empowering communities that have traditional ecological knowledge to basically take some of these open source tools and train the models themselves on their own hardware, on their own knowledge. I mean, it's definitely easier said than done. It's a huge undertaking to do this kind of thing, but it is technically possible if people have the capacity and resources to do that kind of thing. People could do it in a completely private way on their own servers, and do it in a way so that their knowledge would not be leaked. They would still have control over it. I don't know exactly how that would mesh with their own cultural understanding of how the knowledge should be treated, but it is something that they could potentially do if that was something that people were interested in. And yeah, that's something that we've talked about, trying to provide ways, and even if people don't want to train their own large language models in those ways, there are other tools where folks can basically use large language models and then have repositories of their own traditional ecological knowledge that large language models can access at the time of prompting, of generation. and do it in a way that's run on their own servers so that they don't have to leak that information to anybody else.
In the interim, though, or at least the first pass that we've been doing so far in some work that I've been involved in, is to see it as a larger collaboration. So the Western science and the large language models might do some model development and then take that back to communities to work through what's there, supplement it with their knowledge and their objectives to fill out that richer, bigger picture, so that you're respecting all the different knowledge types and using them in different ways to come together with a kind of a mosaic or hybrid at the end. You can do that with local knowledge, traditional knowledge, knowledge across disciplines, all those different kind of approaches. It's effectively an evolution of what we've already been doing in modelling space for, well, at least in my career, for 30 years, and people beyond that. It's just that the AI has become a part of that panel of knowledge types that you interact with to iteratively make the final model structure that you run forward with.
That's fascinating. So it sounds as though there, are some ways to, work around these types of potential issues and, use approaches that have been used in the past, as well as developing new methods to, ensure that you can avoid some of the biases that you might otherwise get with an approach along these lines. I assume that's applicable to, other sorts of challenges that you might face along the way. Are there ways around issues like the black box phenomenon, wherein you don't necessarily know the way that the model that's been developed by the AI is operating, where you can't necessarily see all the parts that you would if you coded them yourself. Are those types of challenges similarly addressable through various techniques and approaches?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think yeah, a lot of the kind of issues and challenges that we highlight are certainly issues that exist today. And a lot of people, these issues aren't just endemic to ecosystem modeling. They're shared across different domains, and everybody who wants to use large language models and AI in these spaces are working on these together. So I imagine we'll solve a lot of these.
One of the approaches that I've seen Scott take is actually get multiple steps of AI. So it's not a single prompt, it's not a single request. It can be a panel of AI, or it can be multiple steps where the AI is actually explaining its train of logic. You have other AIs basically reviewing that logic chain and explaining it further, or even rating it in terms of how well it matches up with other information sources. So that's one approach that Scott does very well in depth, where he gets them to work off each other. Whereas I wouldn't say my prompt skills are as good as Scott. So the approach that I've taken is very much like you see in authors when they're writing a thriller or something, where in the acknowledgement section they will thank the experts that they worked with. They'll acknowledge errors corrected by those experts, but then they say all remaining errors belong to me. And that's the approach that I take. I go through line by line, equation by equation, term by term when I'm collaboratively making a model, and check it against ecological knowledge, check it with other experts, and recognize the creativity where it comes from the AI, but still take responsibility for any remaining errors being by me. So that's one way of actually effectively backstopping, just like you would with a young enthusiastic researcher, to double check the work to make sure that it's all makes sense and that you could explain it to somebody else if you're ever asked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I guess, yeah, two things. What I think is really cool about these large language models is you interact with them like a human, and in effect, it's not really that different from working with another human. Another human is essentially a black box to us. I can't go into your brain and like analyze why you're saying the things that you do. You just do, and I take them at face value, and I think about them. I evaluate what you say against what I understand about the world and logic, et cetera, et cetera. And you can treat large language models in effectively the same way. And what's really nice about them compared to other kind of machine learning approaches where they are effectively black boxes, we don't understand. They can come up with amazing statistical patterns, but we don't really understand how they figure it out. There's a lot of work. There are fields of science that are exploring that. But at the moment, with a large language model, you can ask it to produce something, whether it be code or a database, whatever, and then you can actually go in and you can check it, and you can check it yourself just like you would another human's research, which I think is just that's the really powerful part of this. And the other thing I'll say about this, which I think is really interesting research, is there are folks like in these big AI labs like Anthropic that produced Claude that are doing that kind of analysis, analyzing the neural nets that make up these large language models to actually understand why they say the things they say. And the really cool anecdote, it's they made this, they went in and I can't remember exactly how they did. I think they were talking to their model Claude and asking it to talk about like the Golden Gate Bridge, this idea of Golden Gate Claude, if you've heard of it or your listeners have heard of it. And they realized that every time the Claude talked about the Golden Gate, these little nodes in the neural net lit up. And so they were like, okay, well, what if we dial those up? And so then they dialed them up. And then every time they talked to this version of Claude where they dialed up the Golden Gate references, every question they asked, it just wanted to talk about the Golden Gate Bridge. So it was like, if you ask it, I want to take my date to some beautiful place. Where should I go? And it'll talk, oh, well, you should go to the Golden Gate or, whatever. And so it just could only talk about Golden Gate. And that's just, I think, really fascinating because it shows that people are starting to get a deep understanding of how these tools work. And my dream would be one day that we can have that kind of control over these tools where, for our space and ecosystem modeling, dial up the kind of nodes and neurons in there that make a good modeler or make ecological understanding the really primary thing, leaving aside all like the memes and stuff from the internet that it's trained on, all the junk, and just like that scientific integrity, all those things, dial all those up so you can have this really robust scientific bot that can, I think would be really valuable, and then would be, maybe that would help eliminate some of the, challenges that we're seeing now. But I don't know, that's maybe a bit of a dream.
No, I like that, and I encourage everybody to go check out Golden Gate Quad. It's hilarious. If you tell it you've inherited money, it'll say a great way to spend that might be paying the toll and going over the Golden Gate Bridge.
That's right.
It's hilarious, but I think that speaks to a really interesting point that a lot of times there are values embedded into AI models, of course, and they tend to be the values of those who've created the models, and you're describing a way and potentially for those doing important scientific work to potentially embed their own values into the system so that it works according to their needs and what they feel is important for doing the work that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we trust scientists, well-established scientists who've been around for a long time. We trust the work that they do. We don't go and, well, I mean, people do go and interrogate every little aspect of a scientist's work, but once somebody becomes well-established, you kind of just trust that they're going to do good science, and you're generally able to take what they're saying at face value. And I think with AI tools, they're not there yet, right? We are now taught, and what we're saying is we need to double check everything large language models do because we know that they hallucinate. We know that they can lie to us. And ideally in the future, we'll have ways of developing more trust, and we'll have ways of developing tools that are trustworthy. But we're obviously not there yet. And so for the moment, we just need to be really cautious about how we use them.
I'd say from my experience, and this changes with each model, so you do have to be careful, but the idea of benchmarking the trust too, when will it be so sycophantic it'll give you an answer regardless? And when will it actually just draw the line and say, no, I don't know, and I can't give you that information? I think for AIs, like all humans, to learn that saying I don't know is a fine response. It starts to, relieve some of the nervous tension about how much is it, really giving me back something, where can it draw the line? And I've certainly have had cases where it did that. I was in a meeting where I was using an AI to interpret handwritten notes on pages so they could collate the information much more quickly. And some of the information was in Thai, and one of the AIs would just try and give me an answer regardless, and the other one would come back and say, no, I can't. You need to go talk to a Thai speaker. And I was like, well, I just want the general gist. Give it to me anyway. No, I won't. And so I took it back to the Thai speakers, and they're like, I can't tell you. It's written in some kind of shorthand that they didn't understand. We had to actually track down the Thai scientist who'd written it, who said, yes, it's my personal shorthand and it means this, this, and this. So, try having effectively benchmarks. So that's one of the other lessons I've learnt in watching people use AI well over the last little while, is to have some benchmark tests for performance to say, okay, where is this model at in that, so that you've got a starting point in that relationship to say, do I have to double check absolutely everything, or are there some things that I can do to get a sense of how well you're actually answering this question?
Oh, that's interesting. So we've talked a lot about, the ways that people can and should interact with AIs when they're doing this kind of work. But I had an unrelated question, which is, how did this article come together? You mentioned in it some workshops and other events like that. I'm just kind of curious about, how this came to be in the pages of BioScience.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of started because maybe like a year and a half ago, I basically came to Beth and another one of my supervisors around Trebleco and was like, this field is moving way too fast. It's hard to know, I'll spend, 2 months working on something like the brand new technology come out. I'll spend 2 months kind of working it up and trying to build something on top of it. And then by the time the 2 months is over, um, somebody has released some general tool or it's been integrated seamlessly into the LLMs themselves. And just so I felt like I was really just spinning my wheels, not really getting anything done. And so I just said, we need to all take a step back and just get a bunch of folks together and talk about, not try to avoid this idea of whether or not LLMs will eventually become super sophisticated ecosystem modelers. Just take the stance that that's an inevitability, like just like Beth has just described. Eventually, they'll be as capable as, we use a calculator, we drive our car. We don't question the underlying technology. We just use these tools. Um, and so think about, so if the AI eventually gets to that point, how do we want it to look? There are going to be broader implications than just, whether or not it works, right? There are going to be implications about data fairness. There are going to be implications about access to tools like that, how we use tools like that. And so we basically said, well, let's get a bunch of people together and talk about those kind of issues. And so, yeah, we just reached out to a bunch of colleagues. We have a bunch in CSIRO. We have lots of colleagues who work in this ecosystem modeling space who we were able to chat with, and we also had some external collaborators in other parts of Australia, and we had a couple of international collaborators as well. Um, and yeah, so we just asked, basically had a day and a half to ask that question and have people talk about the different possible opportunities and risks about AI. And yeah, that was, I think, not sort of early days, but the ambition was that we would have a day long workshop, and then overnight I would feed the transcript of the workshop into an AI and come up with a first draft, so that the next day we would then spend the morning of the workshop writing the draft, and by the end of the workshop we would have a paper that we could submit. Now, of course, it didn't happen exactly like that. I went home from the workshop and spent 2 or 3 hours trying to put it into some kind of manuscript, and is you know even in the last year and a half since I did that, the technology has changed drastically. And so back then, the technology was really not up to the task. But I did show up with something, and I was a bit embarrassed to share it with people, and so I declined to do that. And we instead have some more discussion, which was really fruitful. Um, and then from there, there was a lot more shaping of the draft, so that it doesn't really look much like what the AI gave me in the first instance. But it was a really useful exercise, and I have been in other workshops now where people have attempted to do the same thing with sort of differing results. So it was a pretty funny an interesting exercise. Yeah.
The only reflection I'd have, and it's a purely optional reflection, is that it wasn't just all people convinced that that AI future was going to happen or desired to happen. So there was a good deal of encouragement to help people set aside some of their reservations. So there was certainly the critical thought that they brought to the process, but it wasn't a case of, I'd have to say I'm probably enthusiastic about where the potential for AI is, cognizant of the environmental influence of its footprint, of usage, resources, and all that kind of stuff, but still see value in it. Whereas some of the other people in the workshop were a lot more questioning of whether AI actually has a role to do in that and whether you could use it ever to trustworthy. So it was a very diverse group putting their mind to that question and the ethical implications of it and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing because it was kind of interesting. We in the paper we have an example of an agent-based model, the wolves and sheep model that and that was something where just days before the workshop, I had a participant. I think I'd shared the agenda, and I had a participant email me saying, one of the co-authors on the paper emailed me saying, I think it would be good to sort of have an example. Most people don't know where AI is at now, so they don't really know, haven't really thought too much about this. So it'd be great to have an example of what it's capable of. And so I was thinking, like, how do I really show this? Because I, at the time, was like, well, I don't think it's really up to the task of building a full model. I can see the potential, but I don't think it's there yet. And so then I think Anthropic Claude had just released the artifacts feature that they have, and so I was like, let's just see what it can do. So I typed in, can you make a wolf and sheep agent-based model based on the like classic NetLogo model, and it did it instantly. And I was so shocked. I think I got up from my desk and I knocked on people's doors around the hallway. I think Beth was next door to me. I was like, you have to see this. And like literally within seconds, we had this. It's not a perfect model. It's obviously a toy model. But the fact that it was able to produce it in seconds was mind blowing. And that's now almost a year and a half ago. And where we're at now is we're already leaps and bounds beyond that. And when I showed people that in the workshop, it was similar because I did it live coding, like in front of them. Just said, okay, I haven't prepared anything. We're going to type into the box and it's going to produce a model. And we kind of iterated. And I think that was really eye-opening for a lot of people who hadn't really been using AI up to that point or hadn't really considered the implications of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredibly cool, and I would urge everybody to right now go to the show notes and grab a link to the article and go check it out. It appears there. So thus far, we've mostly been talking about some of the best practices that are potentially already in place for these technologies, and the ways that people can and perhaps should be using them now. But I'm wondering if we can sort of zoom the lens back a little bit and talk about the future and what's on the horizon, and what are some of the ways that you would envision this field going forward in the most productive way. What are the sorts of things that people may be able to do in the future, and what should they be doing in the future, and sort of how should they be doing it?
Yes, well, that is a good question. What does the future look like? It's obviously it's impossible to tell. This stuff is moving so fast, and I feel like we're just really holding on with our fingernails here. But I guess from my perspective, and one thing I think we can say for certain is that humans will always be a part of this. Certainly, this kind of ecosystem modeling / ecosystem management kind of space. Whether or not we get to the point where an AI is able to whip up an Atlantis model in minutes and tell us exactly what some fish species will do if we change harvesting rules or whatever. Which I would not be surprised if we get to that point. But even if it were to get to that point, the fact is that humans still have values about how we interact with the natural world, and want to know and need to be able to specify what's important in the natural world and how to handle that, handle those values and wishes within the context of a model. And so humans will still need to direct those kind of tools and those kind of analyses for understanding, so that they actually are getting the insight that they need and are able to balance. Managing the natural world involves trade-offs, and so understanding what the pros and cons of different things are, that's the key thing. And we use these models to gain insight, and depending on what our values are, we structure that in different ways. So yeah, humans will have to kind of provide that to an AI. I know an AI might be able to suggest to us um, different ways of thinking about that, but ultimately it needs to be up to us to decide those kind of things. And I think for me, that's kind of where I imagine this going. And I guess sort of in the short term, it's been interesting chatting with other ecosystem models about this. There's been a range of kind of responses to it from people who have really jumped in and are using AI for everything, and those who have been really resistant. And I guess my thoughts are that people just need to start playing around with these tools and seeing what they're good for themselves and their own workflows, because I think it's sort of unavoidable in terms of how transformative this is going to be. What do you reckon, Beth?
Yeah, so for me, it's a little bit like the evolution of the car. So a century ago, to have a car was a very special thing, and very few people had it, and you almost had to have specialist training and skills as it got more advanced. And that was true even through the period of my grandparents and stuff like that. These days, teenagers get cars. They need a little bit of specialist training at the start, and then it's kind of left up to them. Now, driving the car is a very complex system to be dealing with all the inputs that you've got, but the human brain has got around that. So, fast forward a few decades, probably far less than a century in this case, I could imagine a world where, decision makers do open up their Claude bot equivalent or GPT equivalent or whatever it is by then, and they ask a question of, this is the system I've got issues with, what's all the latest data on it, what's it doing, if I did this kind of intervention, what kind of things might happen. So it is that much more democratized access to system dynamics, that requires the education and the training to be able to use it and the confidence in the tool at the other end. I wouldn't say that many people, in my experience today, know how a car actually works in detail, or a calculator, or the model that runs the electrical grid, or any of those other models that we actually depend on day to day. So I think concerns over the black box nature of it probably won't feature strongly in that person's thinking in the future, as long as they have a sense of the credibility of what sits behind it and the trustworthiness and the feedback of the forecast capacity, the same as we do with weather models today. And then it'll come down to the decision making that you come to. So I was at the UN Ocean Conference a few months ago, and a lady named Yun Shin gave an excellent example of the way that I think it'll play out in the future, in the sense that she says, all of us make decisions with uncertainty on black box models all the time. We look at the weather forecast and decide based on our individual values and context whether we take the umbrella. Do you mind getting wet? Do you have an expensive suede suit you don't want ruined, so you tend to be more risk averse and take the umbrella? Or do you hate having to carry around extra things, so you'll just live with it if you get wet? So you've got the model, you've got the decision, but the ultimate decision is still down to you and how you interpret that information. And that's where I could see models going in the future for this kind of ecosystems, and indeed any complex systems. It'll be just another computational tool that you use that's in your kit box to make your decisions. In a way, that's having it democratized in that way is good, because right now I think one of the limiting factors is the time it takes to develop a model, and the fact that it's such a specialist skill that there's much more demand than we can actually service on that front. Just at a point when the pressures for the outputs of these kind of tools are accelerating phenomenally because of climate change and population pressures and everything that's coming down the pipeline. So having those reliable tools that are just a part of doing business will hopefully mean that we can more easily address those questions in a timely manner as a society going forward. So that's my ideal of where we get to. So we're on top of what it means to have uncertainty in it, the errors that go with it. It's supplied with reliable data, but it is something that's no longer just because I've been doing it for 30 years, people look to me. It's just something that everybody can just flip open their bot and have a chat with.
Great. That is an excellent point, and I think a lovely point on which to leave the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.